Hi everyone, I'm Alex and I'm here to help you with conscious personal growth and meditation. In this video, I'm going to show you a weird little memory technique for remembering terminology and the names of different things. Once you've learnt this easy technique, it will come in handy in a whole variety of situations and you'll feel much more empowered to often easily recall different names and different terms. And it's also especially useful for remembering terminology that you're learning and perhaps might be tested on in an exam or in a public talk or something else along those lines. So recently, I was helping someone who's studying to become a personal trainer, and in order to become a personal trainer, you need to know quite a lot of anatomical terms to describe various locations within the body, planes of movement and the names of different muscle groups and skeletal structures. And she was struggling to remember all of the different names and terms and getting a little bit nervous as she knew that within a few months she would be tested on this to see how many she can remember and what exactly they refer to. And quite frankly, I sympathise with her. As someone who's always thought I had a bad memory, I too often struggle remembering names and terms, and especially when they have Latin or ancient Greek roots, like they so often do in medical and anatomical terminology, for example. But luckily, I knew a little memory technique that I'd learnt a few years ago and was able to quickly teach this to her. And within just a few minutes of practicing this, she could see how much easier it was to recall the terms when being tested on them. So the technique is easy to learn, and once you know it, all you have to do is exercise the technique every time there's a new term to learn, and it will have a much higher chance of encoding into your memory. In order to demonstrate this, as an example, I'm going to go through some of the basic anatomical terminology she was having to learn at the beginning of her course. Of course, if you already know these terms, it won't be as immediately revealing to you just how effective this technique is. But if that's the case, stick with me, you can see how it's done, and then you can practice this with some new information that you don't know yet. So, this is the anatomical position. It's a frame of reference that's used to describe anatomy and movement. As humans, we often change position and orientation. We need a standardized position from which to describe bodily locations and movement. I'm going to briefly go through 12 different terms that describe the locations of different objects within the body. And what we're going to do with this technique is we're going to be linking the word or the term that we're trying to remember with what it's actually referring to, which in this case is a location within the body. And we're going to make that link using our imagination. We're going to use the sound of the term and mental imagery to make the term really stick and really easy to recall. Okay, now wait, I can hear some people saying, but Alex, I'm not a visual person. Well, don't worry. You don't have to be particularly visually minded to learn this. And you can use all of your senses to make the mental image stronger. All you have to do is use your imagination. And if you're the kind of person who thinks you don't have a good imagination, just realize we all have the capability to be creative in some way and imagine things. And in fact, we're doing it often without even realizing it, like when we're thinking about something that might happen in the future, for example. So anyway, let's get into it. So the first term is anterior, and it describes the location of a bodily segment towards the front of the body. And so if we were to be tested on this, they're going to ask something like, which location within the body does the word anterior refer to? Or the anterior deltoid, is it situated on the back of the shoulder or the front of the shoulder? And obviously it's situated on the front of the shoulder. So we need to link the word anterior with the front of the body. And the word anterior, if you're not familiar with it, can be a bit hard to remember straight off the bat. So what's within that word? Well, there's the word ant. So I'm going to imagine a huge ant with a huge six-pack on the front of his body. And so you're thinking, well, this is a bit crazy. Well, that's exactly it. When we're making the link, the trick is for the mental image to have some kind of internal emotional reaction. And in this case, maybe that's that it's a little bit funny or weird. And the internal reactions that seem to make the mental images stick most easily are that they're funny, weird, outrageous, or rude. And the trick is just to notice whether or not you're registering some kind of internal reaction. So I'm imagining this ant with a huge six-pack walking around, and I find it kind of funny and weird. So I know that image is stuck. If you're not getting any kind of internal reaction to it, you probably need to tweak the image until you're either laughing at it or recoiling at it, or you just think, wow, that's super weird. And the second term is posterior, which is the opposite of anterior and describes the location of a bodily segment towards the rear of the body. Now, most people know that the word posterior is a bit of a posh way of referring to someone's butt. So just keeping that in mind, we know the butt's on the back of the body, so I think we don't have to make much effort with that one. Moving on. The third term is inferior, which describes the location of a bodily segment below that of another. So the position of the heart is inferior to that of the brain. So using the word inferior, let's imagine a heart who's really inferior, maybe some kind of medieval peasant, and the brain is like a king. Imagine this big brain with a big crown on, and the heart is really inferior and he's bowing down to the king brain. So the fourth term is superior, and that's the reverse of inferior and describes a location of a bodily segment above that of another. So just from our previous image, we'll already remember that, imagining that the king brain is the superior one, so that's a location of the body above, and the heart is the inferior medieval peasant, so below. The fifth term is medial, which means a bodily segment which is closer or moves towards the midline of the body. So we need to link medial with midline. Medial kind of sounds a bit like medal. And so I'm imagining someone with a medal around their neck. They've won a competition. The medal's obviously dangling in the midline of the body, but I'm imagining the medal is just so big that they can hardly hold their head up. Like they wanted to celebrate having won this competition, but they can't even pull their head up to look up at the crowd because the medal is just so damn heavy. So the sixth term is lateral, which is the opposite of medial and describes a location of a bodily segment towards the outside of another. So lateral, I'm thinking lateral thinking. I'm thinking maybe a boy who's a really good lateral thinker, and he's really creative and really imaginative because of his lateral thinking, but he's so good at it that he's too intelligent for all his friends and he's become an outsider. He has to be on the outside of his friendship circle all the time because whatever he says just goes way over the head of all of his friends, and he's really lonely because of it. And just a side note, when you're doing this yourself and you're creating some images around terms or names of things that you're trying to remember, when you first go to do it, if you're not used to doing this, it might take you a little while on the first or second term that you're trying to remember to come up with some kind of weird or funny image. But once you get into the habit, you'll be able to do this a lot quicker, And once you've done it a few times, you can usually think of something within the word to pick out and create some kind of image around, and you'll get faster and faster at doing this. So the seventh is proximal, and that describes a location of a bodily segment being closer to the center of the body than another. So that might be easy to remember if you know the word proximity. Within proximity, closer to the center. I mean, when I used to play GoldenEye on the N64, which was a James Bond game, they had proxy mines on that. So I'm just imagining someone coming close to the center of a proxy mine and then getting blown up. And call me weird, but I'm going to imagine that proxy mine in the center of a body. And so you can imagine what would happen if that went off. Yeah, okay, I know it's a bit disgusting, but it's sure going to stick. So the eighth is distal, and that's the opposite of proximal and describes a location of an object being further from the body center than another. So the wrist can be described as being distal to the elbows. So distal, I'm thinking distance, and I'm imagining someone who's made of putty. When I was a kid, actually used to get these toys called Stretch Armstrong. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but they were back around in my days, and you could get this toy and stretch his arm really far, so his wrist would be a great distance from his elbow. And perhaps just imagining that toy, but imagining that you can just pull it miles, so just pulling this arm miles out into the distance. Distal, bit of a weird image, but that should stick. The ninth is supination, which describes a bodily segment facing upwards. Supination, see, that's probably a hard one to remember. In my head, I'm just thinking of someone going, sup, like, what's up? With their hands facing upwards, both their arms out and their hands facing upwards. What's up? The 10th is pronation, and that's the converse of supination. So it's when a bodily segment is facing downwards. And pronation, so someone who's really pro-nation, they're for their country, they're lying down on the ground. Perhaps this nation somewhere in my fantasy is so glorious in the eyes of its citizens that they're all just bowing down and lying on the floor in front of the statue of the great leader. The 11th is superficial, and that means close to the surface of the skin. So just to create a little weird mental image here, I'm imagining someone who's really superficial, perhaps a woman who is so superficial that she's just got tons and tons of makeup on her. She's really, really vain. And although she's probably a nice person deep down, all of her friends think that she's really just skin deep. They all say, that woman, she's just skin deep. She's really superficial. The 12th term is deep, and that means away from the surface of the skin. So that shouldn't be too hard to remember, really. We can just remember that as the opposite of the superficial person who's only skin deep. This person is always talking about philosophy, perhaps smoking a lot of weed and thinking everything is deep, man. Not just skin deep, but deep within the body. So, how many do you think you can remember? I mean, do you remember what anterior referred to? Do you remember that ant with the huge six-pack? Do you remember inferior? Do you remember that heart feeling really inferior to the king brain with the big crown? I'll leave all 12 terms up on the screen just for a couple of seconds, and if you like, you can pause it and just see how many you can remember. And you might be surprised if you rewind the video and just skip to where I was explaining the different terms, how many you can actually remember, which is probably going to be a lot more than if you just looked at the terms and then tried to remember them straight off the bat. And so you can use this technique to remember people's names too, whereby when meeting someone, you link that person's name with something about their appearance. So I might make some more videos on memory in the future and expand on this technique or introduce some new ones. Really, it's just a case of getting into the habit of using the technique, which is something that even I myself am constantly working on. But you find that once you just take that few seconds that it takes to exercise it and make it visually and emotionally strong, you can feel the information sticks much easily, much more effortlessly, and often you can remember it weeks, months, or even years later. So with that being said, if you like this video, please give it a like, subscribe for more videos on personal growth, and see you in the next video. Peace.